Imagine buying your dream mansion in cash, only to have strangers show up at your door claiming it was never yours. At 98 years old, Hollywood legend Dick Van Dyke thought he was safe in his golden years, but one letter changed everything. The doorbell rang like a gunshot in the dead of night, shattering the silence of Dick Van Dyke's sprawling California mansion. At 98, the legendary actor was supposed to be enjoying his golden years in a palace of marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and an infinity pool that glowed under the stars. But as he opened the door, heart-pounding, he faced Evelyn Carver, the ice-cold president of the Crestview Estates HOA, her smirk sharper than a blade. "Mr. Van Dyke," she said, thrusting a letter at him, "your deed was never filed. This house isn't yours. You've got 1 week before we foreclose." Wait, what? Foreclose on a multi-million-dollar estate he'd paid for in cash. This wasn't just a mix-up. It was a nightmare, and Dick was about to uncover something sinister. Dick stood frozen in his foyer, the letter trembling in his hands. The mansion was his pride and joy, sleek glass walls, a private theater for rewatching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and a rose garden he tended with the same care he'd once given his dance routines. He'd bought it fair and square, every paper signed, every I dotted. So why was Evelyn, flanked by 2 HOA goons with clipboards, claiming he was a squatter? Her eyes gleamed with something dark, like she enjoyed watching him squirm. "Fix this or lose everything," she hissed before striding back to her black SUV, leaving Dick alone under the glow of his chandelier. He didn't waste a second. Dick marched to his study, a grand room packed with awards and old Hollywood scripts, and yanked open his safe. There it was, the deed to his estate, notarized and stamped by the county. His lawyer had filed it months ago. He double-checked every line, his pulse racing. It was legit. So why was the HOA coming for him? He called his lawyer, who sounded rattled. "I'll check the county records, Dick, but this smells wrong," he said. Wrong was an understatement. Dick's gut screamed that Evelyn and her HOA weren't just picky neighbors. They were playing a dangerous game. The next morning, Dick took matters into his own hands. He strolled through Crestview Estates, trying to look casual while his eyes scanned for clues. The neighborhood was pristine, manicured lawns, million-dollar homes, but something felt off. Neighbors avoided his gaze, hurrying inside when he waved. At the community's entrance, a shiny new billboard caught his eye. "Pinnacle Properties, luxury condos coming soon." Condos, in a gated estate of sprawling mansions. Dick's stomach churned. He spotted a name on the billboard's fine print. Victor Slade, Crestview HOA treasurer. A quick phone search revealed Victor was a board member and a Pinnacle Properties exec. Coincidence? No way. Back in his mansion, Dick's mind raced. Was the HOA working with Pinnacle to push him out? And why his house? He started digging online, but Crestview's HOA website was a labyrinth of rules and fees, no answers. Then he noticed something chilling. 3 other homes on his street had for sale signs, all recent. Had the HOA targeted them too? He was about to call a neighbor when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions or you'll regret it." Dick's blood ran cold. Who was watching him? That evening he heard a rustle outside. Peering through his glass walls, he saw a shadow dart across his rose garden. His heart thumped as he grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the terrace, the pool's glow casting eerie reflections. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. No answer, just the hum of crickets. Then he spotted it, a crumpled piece of paper caught in the bushes. He snatched it up, his hands shaking as he read the scrawled words. "They faked the records. Check the county." It was signed C. Dick's mind spun. Who was C? And what did they mean by faked records? He glanced at the neighbor's house across the street, Clara, the quiet widow who'd barely spoken to him. Was she trying to warn him? Or was this a trap? He clutched the note, his luxurious mansion suddenly feeling like a gilded cage. The HOA wasn't just after his home. They were hiding something big, and Dick was about to step into a hornet's nest. But here, that's where things got really twisted. The county recorder's office smelled of dust and old ink. A place where paper trails lived forever. Or at least they were supposed to. Dick Van Dyke stepped up to the counter, his crisp deed trembling in his hands. 98 years of life behind him, but right now he felt like a rookie on a Hollywood set, blindsided, unprepared, thrown into a role he hadn't auditioned for. The clerk adjusted her glasses, took the document, and typed his parcel number into her system. Tap, tap, pause, her frown deepened. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "There's no record of this deed, not under your name." "Not under anyone's." Dick's heart dropped. "That's impossible," he snapped. His voice echoed through the sterile office. "This property was filed months ago. I paid in full." She shrugged, almost sympathetic, but her eyes avoided his. "Then someone made it disappear." Disappear, the word clawed at his chest. He slid his notarized copy across the counter. "Look again, everything's here, the signatures, the county stamp, the notary seal, it's legit." Clerk leaned close, whispered so only he could hear. I believe you, but the system doesn't, and around here the system always wins. Before Dick could press her further, his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Paper won't save you, stop digging or else. His throat tightened. He scanned the lobby. A janitor mopped the floor. A man in a gray suit pretended to scroll his phone. A woman clutched a manila folder like her life depended on it. Were they just strangers or eyes planted on him? He shoved the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't going to let fear choke him. Not here, not now. Print me everything you have, Dick demanded. His voice trembled with both age and fury. The clerk hesitated, glanced around nervously, then hit print. The machine groaned and spit out a thin stack of papers. Dick flipped through them, transaction histories, ownership transfers, legal filings. Only half the pages were wrong. Words were smudged. Entire lines blacked out with thick strokes of ink. One page looked digitally altered, the fonts inconsistent, the seals blurred. Who did this? Dick muttered under his breath. The last page made his blood run cold. At the bottom, in faint gray, was a corporate stamp, Pinnacle Properties. His fingers tightened on the file. Evelyn Carver, Victor Slade, Crestview HOA, and now Pinnacle Properties. They weren't just circling his home like vultures. They were rewriting history to erase him. But that wasn't the only thing on the page. In the corner, scribbled lightly in pencil, almost invisible, were words. Meet me at midnight, Rose Garden. See Clara, the widow across the street, the one who barely spoke. The one he suspected had left the first note. Dick's pulse quickened. If she had inside knowledge, she might be the only ally he had. But meeting her alone at midnight when the HOA clearly had eyes on him, that smelled like a trap. Still, he had no choice. That night the mansion was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Dick sat in his study, the clock ticking louder than his thoughts. 11:47 p.m. The note burned in his pocket. He slipped out the back door, past the glowing pool, and crossed into his rose garden. The moonlight painted the petals silver, but the shadows between the hedges looked darker than they should. Clara, he whispered. A branch cracked. He spun, flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing, just the rustle of leaves. Then a figure stepped out. A woman in a long coat, her face hidden under a scarf. She moved cautiously, eyes darting like a hunted animal. It's me, she hissed, her voice shook. Clara, Dick's grip tightened on the flashlight. Why are you helping me? Because they'll destroy you the way they destroyed my husband, she whispered. He tried to fight them. He dug too deep. Then one night, her voice cracked. He never came home. Dick's breath caught. The HOA? She nodded. The HOA is Pinnacle. Pinnacle is the HOA. Victor Slade's been laundering deals through fake filings for years. They erase ownership, forge records, and seize property. Then they sell it to developers. Your deed was filed. I saw it myself, but they deleted it. Dick's skin crawled. Deleted ownership, like deleting a file on a computer. You need proof, Clara said, glancing over her shoulder. The county's records aren't just tampered. They're rerouted through Pinnacle's private servers. If you get inside, you'll see the real filings. Get inside where? Dick asked. Before she could answer, headlights cut across the garden. A black SUV slowed near his gate. Clara's eyes widened. They followed me. The engine idled low and threatening. Dick pulled her deeper into the hedges, heart hammering. The SUV door creaked open. Heavy boots hit the pavement. A man's voice cold, commanding. Search the property. Flashlights flickered across his yard. Shadows moved, hunting. Clara grabbed his wrist, nails digging into his skin. You don't understand. Once they mark you, they don't stop, until the deed is gone or you are. Dick's chest pounded. He thought of his mansion, his memories, his rose garden, the life he had built brick by brick, and now faceless predators were circling to strip it all away. Go, Clara hissed. Act normal, don't let them know you met me, and whatever you do, don't trust anyone on that board. Before he could stop her, she slipped into the night, vanishing behind the hedges. Dick stumbled back toward his terrace just as a flashlight beam swept over him. Evening, Mr. Van Dyke, a deep voice said. A tall man in a Crestview security uniform stepped forward, his smile thin and sharp. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. You didn't see anyone, did you? Dick forced a smile. Just me and my roses. The guard's eyes lingered on him, unblinking. Then he smirked. Good, because if we did find anyone trespassing, it wouldn't end well. The man turned, signaling the others. The SUV rolled away, slow and deliberate, like a predator retreating only to strike again later. Dick exhaled, his hands shaking. He looked at the crumpled note in his pocket, meet me at midnight. Rose Garden. Now he had answers, but he also had new enemies, and every move he made would be watched. He stepped back into his mansion, locked the doors, and stared at the glowing infinity pool. The fight wasn't about a deed anymore. It was about survival. And the HOA had just declared war. Midnight crept over Crestview estates like a velvet curtain, the manicured lawns glowing faintly under pale moonlight. Dick Van Dyke, wrapped in a trench coat against the chill, stepped into his rose garden clutching a flashlight. The air smelled sweet, but the silence carried a different taste, danger. Somewhere out there, someone calling themselves C had promised to meet him. The roses rustled. "Mr. Van Dyke," came a whisper. He swung the light, and there she was, Clara, the quiet widow from across the street. Her frail frame was wrapped in a gray shawl, her face pale, eyes darting like a trapped bird. "You wrote this?" Dick held up the note. She nodded quickly. "They're lying to you. Evelyn and her board, they've been erasing deeds, falsifying records. Yours isn't the first." Dick's heart skipped. Why target me?" Clara leaned closer, her voice trembling. "It's not about you, it's about the land. Pinnacle Properties has a deal with the HOA, clear out homeowners, demolish estates, build luxury condos. They'll make millions. They already forced out 3 families on this street. Yours is the crown jewel." A twig snapped behind them. Clara froze. Dick turned the flashlight toward the noise. Nothing. Just shadows stretching across the marble patio, but Clara clutched his arm. "They're watching, always watching. If they know I spoke to you, I'm finished." She slipped a folded paper into his hand. "These are copies from the county files. They changed the ownership histories. Look, Victor Slade's signature is everywhere." Before Dick could ask more, headlights flashed. At the end of the street, a black SUV rolled by slowly, its tinted windows like blank eyes. Clara pulled away. "I have to go, don't trust anyone." Then she vanished into the night, swallowed by the shadows of her house. The next morning, Dick studied Clara's papers at his kitchen island. Sure enough, the documents had been altered. His name had been scratched out in one column, replaced by Pinnacle Properties in another. But the original marks faintly showed underneath, like ghosts of the truth. Someone inside the county office was helping them cover their tracks. He barely had time to process when his phone rang. Evelyn Carver. "Mr. Van Dyke," she purred, her voice like poisoned honey. "I hear you've been asking questions. Bad idea. You don't want to be the example." Dick gritted his teeth. "I have proof, Evelyn. The deed is mine. The house is mine." She chuckled. "Paper means nothing when the board decides otherwise. Sell quietly and we'll make it worth your while. Refuse and you'll regret every sunrise you see." The line clicked dead. By afternoon, the intimidation escalated. A letter slid under his door, $10,000 fine for unauthorized garden modifications. The roses he planted himself now violated HOA landscaping rules. An hour later, another notice appeared. Noise complaint, late-night disturbance. At 98, Dick hadn't hosted a party in years, but the paper was already signed. Then came the knock. 2 HOA enforcers stood on his porch, clipboards in hand, eyes cold. "Routine inspection," one said flatly, barging past him. They strode through his mansion, jotting notes, muttering violations under their breath. One paused at his theater room, eyeing the walls of awards and framed scripts. "Lot of history here," he sneered. "Shame if it all had to go." Dick's blood boiled. This wasn't just harassment, it was psychological warfare. That night, unable to sleep, Dick sat in his study staring at Clara's documents. He thought of Evelyn's smirk, Victor's name on the billboard, the SUV crawling past his house. The pieces were aligning into a sinister picture. Suddenly, a noise cracked the silence. A thud, then another. Dick grabbed his flashlight and crept to the window. In the moonlit yard, his rose bushes were torn apart, flowers ripped and trampled. Spray-painted across the garden wall were 3 words in dripping red letters, "Leave or else." His hands shook, but his resolve hardened. They wanted him scared, broken, willing to give up. But Dick Van Dyke had faced Hollywood critics, grueling performances, and decades of pressure. He wasn't about to let a crooked HOA steal his home. He picked up the phone, calling his lawyer. "We're not just fighting foreclosure anymore," he said, his voice steady. "We're fighting a conspiracy." And as he hung up, his eyes fell again on the condo billboard at the neighborhood entrance. The slogan burned in his mind. Luxury condos coming soon. Coming soon unless he stopped them. But then came the thought that chilled him. If they'd already erased him from the county system, how deep did this scheme go? And how far would Evelyn and Victor go to silence him? The shadows of a scheme loomed larger than ever, and Dick was standing in their crosshairs. But here's where things were about to get even darker. The night stretched heavy over Crestview Estates, but Dick Van Dyke couldn't sleep. Every shadow across his glass walls felt alive, every creak of the marble floor like an intruder's footstep. He replayed Clara's whispered warning in his mind, "They'll stop at nothing." And then her disappearance. The HOA wasn't just ruthless, they were dangerous. By dawn, Dick had made up his mind. He couldn't rely on whispers and scraps of paper anymore. He needed proof, real, hard evidence that the HOA had forged his deed. The county records office the next morning, he drove into downtown Los Angeles, his old convertible rumbling like a relic from a happier time. The county clerk's office was a towering beige building that smelled faintly of dust and bureaucracy. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched like a labyrinth. A young clerk eyed him suspiciously when he asked for Crestview's property deeds. "Why do you need those records, sir?" She asked, her voice flat. Dick smiled warmly, the same charm that had carried him through Hollywood's golden years. Because, sweetheart, I think someone else trying to steal my house, and I need to prove them wrong. She hesitated, then pulled a thick folder from the archives. Dick's heart sank as he flipped through the pages. The official deed for his mansion was gone. In its place was a new filing, dated only a week ago, listing Pinnacle Properties as the rightful owner. His hands trembled. They'd done it. The HOA had erased him from the books. Victor Slade appears as Dick stood frozen, a smooth voice cut through the silence. "Looking for something, Mr. Van Dyke?" He turned. Victor Slade, the HOA treasurer and Pinnacle exec, leaned casually against the counter in a tailored suit, his grin dripping arrogance. Two men in black suits flanked him, sunglasses hiding their eyes even indoors. "You know," Victor said, adjusting his cufflinks, "you'd be happier if you just walked away, sell the house. Enjoy your retirement. Let us handle the future of Crestview." Dick's jaw tightened. "That house is mine, and I won't let a bunch of crooks take it." Victor chuckled, a sound colder than Evelyn Carver's smirk. "Crooks? Oh no, Dick, we're visionaries. You're just standing in the way." The clerk suddenly excused herself and hurried out, leaving the four men alone. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Last warning, old man, stop digging or we'll bury you in more than paperwork." The chase Dick didn't wait to hear more. He shoved the forged file into his jacket and bolted out the door. The county building echoed with the pounding footsteps of Victor's men chasing him. Outside, he sprinted to his convertible, the California sun blazing down, and gunned the engine. Tires screeched as he tore out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, a black SUV roared after him. The chase was straight out of a movie, Dick weaving through traffic on Ventura Boulevard, the SUV ramming his bumper, horns blaring. Adrenaline surged through him like he was 30 again. He swerved down a side street, heart hammering, and cut through an alley too narrow for the SUV. The vehicle screeched to a halt behind him, blocked. Dick sped away, breathless, clutching the stolen file. For now, he was safe, but how long could he outrun them? Back at the mansion that evening, he spread the forged papers across his desk. The signatures, the stamps, even the notary's seal, it all looked flawless. Too flawless. Only someone deep in the system could pull off forgeries this airtight. A noise jolted him from his thoughts, a faint humming coming from the rose garden. Dick stepped onto the terrace, the pool glowing behind him. In the bushes, a small drone buzzed, its camera pointed directly at him. He grabbed a rake from the garden shed and swatted it down, sparks flying as it shattered against the marble tiles. Picking up the wreckage, he found a Pinnacle Properties logo on its side. "They're watching me," he whispered. The shocking discovery later that night, Dick returned to his study to dig deeper. He scanned the forged records, cross-referencing names and signatures online. That's when he saw it, a notary's seal belonging to someone long dead. The signature wasn't just forged. The HOA was using ghost paperwork. And worse, the same notary's seal appeared on dozens of Crestview deeds over the last year. Clara had been right. The HOA wasn't just targeting him, they were stealing the whole neighborhood, one house at a time. His stomach dropped. If they'd already silenced Clara, who would they come for next? The knock at midnight. As the clock struck midnight, a knock echoed through his mansion. Slow, deliberate, he froze. The chandelier light trembled above him. Clutching the wrecked drone, he crept to the door. When he opened it, there was no one there, just a small velvet envelope resting on the doormat. Inside was a single black card with silver lettering. "You've crossed the line. Tomorrow night, Crestview burns." The morning sun spilled through the glass walls of Dick's mansion, but it felt cold, sterile, like the light itself had been stripped of warmth. He hadn't slept. The discovery of the altered county records gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't pull out. The evidence was clear. Someone had tampered with the deed, and Evelyn Carver, the HOA president, wasn't working alone. Dick's lawyer called at dawn. "I found the filing log," he whispered, his voice tense. "Your deed went through the system, but then poof, it vanished. Someone replaced it with a blank placeholder." "Replaced?" Dick repeated, pacing across his study past framed movie posters and golden statuettes. "By who?" "That's the problem. The trail leads to Pinnacle Properties, and Dick. One of their signatories is Victor Slade. He's not just the HOA treasurer, he's Evelyn's right-hand man." The puzzle pieces were snapping together in the ugliest way possible. The HOA wasn't making a mistake. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover. And Pinnacle wasn't just sniffing around the neighborhood, they were buying it out house by force if necessary. But there was a deeper sting. The night before, Clara, his quiet neighbor, had slipped him the note about faked records. She was risking everything to warn him, yet when Dick called her that morning, her line went straight to voicemail. His gut churned. Something was wrong. Later that day, Dick got an invitation he didn't expect, a casual brunch with Victor Slade, the HOA treasurer, the same man whose name was all over Pinnacle's shady development paperwork. Against his better judgment, Dick went. He had to. They met at a gleaming rooftop restaurant in downtown LA, the kind of place where politicians and power brokers traded favors over champagne. Victor was waiting, dressed in a crisp suit that gleamed under the morning light. He smiled like a wolf pretending to be a friend. "Dick," Victor said smoothly, pulling out a chair. "You've been busy asking questions, stirring up things best left alone." "I'm just protecting what's mine," Dick shot back, lowering himself into the chair. "My house, my home." Victor leaned closer, his cologne sharp, his eyes colder than steel. "Your home sits on prime land. Pinnacle wants it. The HOA wants it. And frankly, you don't have the stamina for a fight at your age. Why not sell quietly? Take a handsome payout, retire somewhere. Easier." Dick's jaw tightened. "You forged records to push me out. That's not business. That's theft." Victor's smile widened, but his voice dropped into something darker. "It's survival. Crestview's board is already on our side. Even your so-called allies won't stand with you. People flip fast when the money's right." And that's when Victor dropped the bomb. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were emails, his own lawyer's name at the top, promises of cooperation, a deal signed in secret. Dick's stomach dropped. His trusted ally, his lawyer, had been compromised. The betrayal hit like a knife in the back. For a moment, the world spun around him. All the nights of rehearsing lines, all the decades of performing for adoring audiences, all the trust he'd given to people who managed his life, now shattered in one cruel reveal. Victor leaned back, sipping his champagne. "You see, you're alone in this. Sell now and maybe you walk away with dignity. Refuse, and Evelyn will crush you in ways you can't even imagine." But Dick wasn't broken, not yet. His eyes hardened. "I fought tougher villains than you on screen. And let me tell you something, I always outlast them." Victor's smirk faltered for just a second, just long enough for Dick to stand, fold the folder under his arm, and walk away without another word. His legs trembled, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. Back in his mansion, Dick spread the papers across his desk. The betrayal was real. His lawyer had sold him out. The HOA and Pinnacle were closing in. And now Clara's silence weighed heavy. Was she safe? Or had Evelyn gotten to her too? As he sat alone, the chandelier light flickering above him, a single truth seared through his chest. This was no longer about paperwork or deeds. This was war. And war meant fighting back. But here's where the story took an even darker turn. The morning light in Crestview Estates was deceptively serene. Manicured lawns, sparkling pools, and quiet streets gave no hint of the storm brewing. But inside Dick Van Dyke's mansion, tension hung thick like fog. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the rose bushes felt like a threat. Dick had spent the night poring over evidence, reconstructing the timeline of deception. The HOA had forged his deed, Pinnacle Properties had pressured him, and even his lawyer had been compromised. He realized one thing clearly. Evelyn Carver wouldn't stop until he was out of Crestview. By mid-morning, Dick decided it was time to confront the HOA head-on. He wasn't going to wait for another threat or another anonymous text. He needed to face Evelyn and her board to expose their scheme publicly. Arriving at the HOA office, he was met by Evelyn herself, standing in the lobby with that same cold smirk that had haunted his nights. "Mr. Van Dyke," she said sweetly, "I see you've been busy." Dick held up the stack of documents, the forged deeds, emails from Victor, proof of the county record tampering. "I know what you've been doing. And I'm not leaving without answers." Evelyn's expression hardened. She waved a hand and the board members stepped closer, a wall of authority and menace. "Answers?" she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You'll get answers when you stop interfering." The tension escalated, the room charged with silent threats. Dick held his ground. He pulled out his phone, ready to record the confrontation, knowing that documentation could be his only protection. "You can try to intimidate me," he said, voice steady, "but the truth is on my side." Evelyn's smirk faltered for a moment, enough for Dick to notice the slightest crack in her composure, but she recovered quickly, her voice sharp as a blade. "You've underestimated us for too long, Dick, and now you're going to regret it." That evening, back at his mansion, Dick prepared for what was coming next. He knew Evelyn wouldn't stop at words. The HOA had resources, legal power, and influence. And he had. His determination, his evidence, and the fire in his heart that had carried him through decades in Hollywood. He looked out at the glowing infinity pool, the shadows dancing across the marble floors, and whispered to himself, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." And somewhere in the distance, under the veil of night, he could feel the HOA watching, plotting, waiting. The showdown was near, and Dick Van Dyke knew that facing their wrath would test every ounce of courage he had left. The streets of Crestview Estates were quiet that morning, bathed in sunlight that made the manicured lawns and glimmering pools look deceptively peaceful. But inside Dick Van Dyke's mansion, tension hung like a storm cloud. He hadn't slept a wink. The forged deeds, Victor Slade's emails, and the tampered county records lay spread across his study desk. each document a dagger reminding him that Evelyn Carver and the HOA weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to take everything he owned. Even his lawyer, a trusted ally for years, had sold him out. The betrayal burned in him hotter than any anger he'd felt on set during his decades in Hollywood. Dick's mind raced as he considered his options. Retreating wasn't one of them. If he stepped back now, the HOA and Pinnacle would sweep through Crestview like a storm, taking more homes, leaving residents powerless. And Clara, if she had tried to warn him before disappearing, might still be in danger. Every instinct told him that inaction was far more dangerous than confrontation. By mid-morning, he made a decision. He would face Evelyn Carver and her board directly, exposing their lies and corruption. If nothing else, he would document everything publicly so no one could silence him again. With the folder of evidence clutched tightly under his arm, Dick drove to the HOA office, his vintage convertible slicing through the quiet streets with a low rumble. The building loomed ahead, a gleaming facade of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fear. He could feel it in the way the receptionist barely met his eyes. And then he saw her, Evelyn Carver, standing near the reception desk, immaculate in her tailored black suit, silver hair perfectly coiled. Her smirk was the same that had haunted him for nights, cold and cutting, radiating control. Behind her, the rest of the board members flanked her like sentinels, their expressions unreadable but their presence menacing. "Mr. Van Dyke," Evelyn said, her voice honeyed yet venomous. "I see you've been busy." Dick held up the folder of evidence, forever altered deeds, emails implicating Victor Slade, and the proof of county record tampering. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not leaving without answers." Evelyn's smirk faltered just slightly. "Answers? You'll get answers when you stop interfering," she said, a dangerous edge creeping into her tone. She gestured to the board, who advanced a step, their silence heavy like a cage closing in. Dick's pulse raced, but he didn't waver. He pulled out his phone, tapping record. Every threat, every veiled move, every smirk and glance, he would capture it. If they wanted a battle, he would fight it with evidence, courage, and every ounce of wit he had left. "You think you can intimidate me," Dick continued, raising his chin, "but the truth is on my side." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You've underestimated us for too long. You've poked around where you shouldn't, and now you're going to regret it." Her words were sharp, slicing the air like a whip. But Dick had faced antagonists before, on stage, on set, in the glare of Hollywood lights, and he had learned that the bravest thing wasn't waiting for rescue. It was standing your ground. After what felt like hours, the confrontation ended with Evelyn retreating to her office, the board members trailing behind. Dick walked out of the HOA building, heart hammering but spirit ignited. For the first time, he realized the power of documenting the truth. Even if Evelyn tried to silence him, even if Victor and Pinnacle escalated their threats, he had leverage, proof that the world couldn't ignore. Back at his mansion, the glow of the infinity pool reflected the tension still coiling in his chest. He spread the evidence across his desk again, double-checking every page, every signature. Every detail confirmed it. The HOA's deception was systematic, ruthless, and designed to crush anyone who dared challenge them. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a warning to anyone who stood in their way. As evening fell, Dick stepped onto the terrace, gazing at the darkened streets below. Shadows stretched across the marble floors, the night thick with uncertainty. Somewhere in the distance, he felt the weight of eyes upon him. The HOA was watching. Evelyn Carver had resources, influence, and ruthless cunning. The question was no longer whether she would act, but how far she would go. Yet in that moment of quiet, Dick felt something else, resolve. The stakes were higher than ever. The deception ran deep. And now it wasn't just about saving a home. It was about standing up to a corrupt system, exposing the betrayal, and fighting for truth. Dick whispered to himself, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." As the night deepened, he made a plan. Evidence had to be shared publicly, legal avenues pursued, allies found, anyone willing to stand against the creeping corruption. Every shadow, every note, every suspicious figure from the previous night suddenly made sense. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. Tomorrow he would face them again. Evelyn, Victor, the board, they might believe they had the upper hand, but Dick Van Dyke was determined to prove them wrong. The war had entered a dangerous new phase, and he would meet it head-on, armed with courage, intelligence, and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. The stage was set. The players were in place. And the showdown between a legendary actor and the HOA from hell was about to reach its most intense, suspense-filled act yet. The courtroom was silent, every sound magnified, the rustle of papers, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the occasional tap of a gavel. Dick Van Dyke sat in the front row, his hands gripping the polished oak table, eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. Months of threats, betrayals, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. This was the ultimate confrontation. Him versus Evelyn Carver and the Crestview HOA. Evelyn, immaculate in a black suit, sat across the room, flanked by her board members and Victor Slade. Their confidence radiated from them, but Dick could see the tiniest cracks, the brief glance exchanged between Victor and a board member, the flicker of doubt behind Evelyn's carefully masked smirk. They believed they had outsmarted him. They believed he was alone. The judge entered, and the room settled into a tense hush. Dick's lawyer, one who had not betrayed him, stood beside him, ready to present the case. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "we are here to prove that the HOA knowingly falsified property records and conspired with Pinnacle Properties to seize Mr. Van Dyke's home unlawfully." As the case unfolded, Dick watched exhibits projected onto the screen. The original deed, the forged copy, the email chain implicating Victor Slade, even the cryptic note signed C. Each piece of evidence painted a damning portrait of a conspiracy meticulously orchestrated. Evelyn rose to speak, her voice calm and collected. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. Our actions have always followed HOA guidelines. Mr. Van Dyke's claims are exaggerated." But as the trial progressed, the cracks in her story widened. Witnesses, neighbors who had previously feared retaliation began stepping forward. Clara appeared, courage shining in her eyes, recounting how she had tried to warn Dick and had witnessed suspicious activity around the HOA's office. Emails, records, and phone logs, all meticulously gathered by Dick, formed a compelling narrative. Dick could feel the room shift. The power that Evelyn had wielded for months, the intimidation, the whispers, the threatening texts, was losing its grip. The jury's eyes were fixed on him, not out of fear, but in curiosity, drawn into the story of a man defending not just his home, but the principle of truth and justice. Hours passed like minutes. Objections were raised, lawyers debated fiercely, but every lie told by Evelyn and her cohorts was systematically dismantled by Dick's evidence. The tension was almost unbearable, a knot in the pit of his stomach that refused to loosen. Every breath, every gesture mattered. Finally, the judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the HOA engaged in fraudulent activities intended to dispossess Mr. Van Dyke of his property. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Van Dyke retains full ownership of his estate, and the HOA and Pinnacle Properties are subject to legal penalties. A wave of relief washed over Dick. The weight of the past months, the fear, the betrayal, the uncertainty, finally lifted. He allowed himself a small, triumphant smile, glancing briefly at Clara, who nodded in quiet approval. Yet even in victory, Dick knew the story wasn't completely over. The courtroom erupted in whispers, cameras flashing as reporters captured the moment. Evelyn and Victor were furious, their defeat public and humiliating. But somewhere deep inside, Dick felt a lingering unease, the subtle reminder that power can find new ways to strike. Back at his mansion that evening, Dick walked through the grand foyer, the familiar sights of his home. The rose garden, the infinity pool, the glass walls reflecting the twilight, reminding him of what he had fought for. The deed was safe, the truth had won, and yet the shadows of the past months clung faintly to the corners of the mansion. He poured himself a glass of wine, sitting by the fireplace, and reflected on everything. The fight had tested him in ways Hollywood never could: patience, courage, resilience, and unwavering moral clarity. He thought of every step, every risk, every moment of fear, and realized that sometimes real life demanded a hero to rise without a script. As the stars appeared above Crestview, twinkling like tiny lights of hope, Dick smiled. The HOA's schemes had been unmasked, the lies exposed, and his home secured. But the world was unpredictable. There would always be challenges, adversaries, and those who sought to abuse power. Yet Dick Van Dyke had proven something essential: courage, determination, and truth could triumph even against the most ruthless opponents. And somewhere in the shadows, a new note appeared, slid under his door. Only a single word was written: watch. Dick's eyes narrowed, a sly grin forming. "Bring it on," he whispered. The battle was won, but the story, the legend, was far from over.